Hello and welcome to the History of Modern Greece. I'm your host, Daniel Roberts, and I'm here with my father, George, and our theme music is brought to you by Mark Youngerman. This is a podcast that covers the events from the fall of ancient Greece to the modern day. This is episode 2, the Mycenaean Greeks. The Hellenic branch of the Proto-Indo-European tribe was now in Greece. It took several thousand years, but they finally made it. And what they saw when they settled along the coast of Greece was a massive trading empire sailing up and down the Aegean. The Minoans were everywhere, and they dominated trade. If a Greek man wanted to go fishing in the Aegean Sea, there was a good chance they would run into a Minoan trading ship. To the Minoans, the Hellenes were barbarians, brutish and warlike people who descended down from the wild lands of the north. These Hellenic people started to settle, and with contact from the Minoans in the ocean, they became civilized. They adopted their own form of writing, and although they were using a strange alphabet with hieroglyphs and cuneiform, we have been able to translate texts into modern English. You see, at first they looked like any other old language from antiquity, strange and unrecognizable as anything legible today. But it was soon discovered that this language, which archaeologists today call linear B tablets, was actually the Greek language. It might have been using a different alphabet system, but this language was Greek. And this makes it the oldest living language in history. The Greek people founded settlements in the southern peninsula at the bottom of Greece, otherwise known as the Peloponnese. Now, this peninsula was connected to the mainland via a narrow strip of land, which acted as the gates to the Peloponnese. It is here that the Greeks founded a civilization that mirrored the Minoans, and we call this civilization the Mycenaeans, because the ruins of their civilization was found next to the modern city of Mycenae. But this civilization flourished over 3,600 years ago. They were a warlike people and were a stark contrast to the Minoan overlords of the region. But their navy couldn't compete with the Minoans, so they remained mostly on the mainland. The only reason we know about the Mycenaeans today is because of the work of a German amateur archaeologist who had a lot of money to spend after serving in the Crimean War. His name was Heinrich Schliemann. He was obsessed with Greek mythology, and now that Greece was free to explore and no longer part of the Ottoman Empire, he spent most of his money digging up old ruins in Greece. This is both a blessing and a curse, because when this man dug on a new site, he usually destroyed more than he discovered. He didn't categorize the layers of dirt and instead just started digging with a shovel until he found something interesting. He is said to have uncovered a rare jewel of the Mycenaeans and gave it to his wife, who later lost it. Just think of the history this item had, and it was just given away. This discovery led Heinrich to believe he uncovered the famous Achaeans from the legends of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, and believing this, it set Heinrich off on a crazy adventure to follow the legends of ancient Greece as if they were real events, in hopes that it would lead him to more famous archaeological discoveries.
The Mycenaeans' head palace state was situated in the Peloponnese, that is on the southern peninsula of Greece, but right at the mouth of the Isthmus of Corinth. The Isthmus of Corinth is that narrow strip of land that connects the Peloponnese to the rest of Greece. This was a strategically important part of land to control. It meant that the Mycenaean palace state had absolute control over all trade that went across the isthmus. They were establishing themselves as a dominant power on the land, but the water was still out of their grips for now. Burial mounds have been discovered in these ancient ruins and have proven the Mycenaean Greeks were very well armed with modern Bronze Age weaponry, including bronze swords, arrowheads, armor shields, and even chariots. These warrior-class men of Mycenae were now butting up against the peaceful but powerful maritime traders of the Minoan Empire. And at first the Minoans probably kicked the crap out of the Greeks. Did I say crap or crack? I better say it
You
again.
said crack.
That's what I thought. At first, am I ready to go again?
Yeah.
At first, the Minoans probably kicked the crap out of the Greeks, but the Greeks were more ferocious and aggressive. Archaeological evidence proves the Mycenaeans were already trading wealth with faraway empires, while the Minoans were the dominant power. And the artwork and building structures of not only the Minoans, but also the Egyptians began to influence the Greeks. They had gold buried in their elaborate tombs, and there weren't any gold mines in Greece, at least not this far south. There are some scholars who think the Mycenaeans were hiring themselves out as mercenaries for the Minoans, as they were violent, aggressive people, and the Minoans had boats. And it is likely that the Egyptians were hiring these mercenaries to fight in their local wars. The Greeks were now getting to see the vast riches of the Bronze Age for their own eyes, and they also realized that they were the best warriors. This made the Minoan civilization look like a tempting target. Around the year 1600, or maybe even as late as 1500 BC, the island of Thera, or modern-day Santorini, exploded with such cataclysmic force that it vaporized anyone living on the island. There were earthquakes and rumblings that would have alerted the people living on the island, but when it finally exploded with its full force, it released more energy than the most powerful volcano any human had ever seen in more than 10,000 years. This volcanic eruption completely destroyed the settlement on Thera, but also sent kilotons of rock and ash into the sky, blocking out the sun for days and causing a winter that would last several years. Ash rained down from the sky for months, and tsunamis raced across the ocean and destroyed any fleets caught in its path, and completely wiped out any port city in its wake. Unfortunately for the Minoans, this disaster seemed to have wiped out their navy and all their ports along their coast. This volcanic eruption was so great that even China felt its effects. The records in China state that for a couple of years the summer sun was very dim and was accompanied by a yellow fog. The lack of sun in the summer and the odd bout of frost and hail devastated the crops of all their cereal, which led to a great famine and the starvation of most of the Chinese population. This led to an economic disaster, followed by the collapse of the Zhao dynasty.
This was the moment the Mycenaeans were waiting for, and they pounced on the Minoans with speed and violence. They took control of their cities one by one, and eventually the capital city of the Minoan Empire, the palace state of Knossos, fell to the Mycenaean Greeks. When the Greeks settled on the island of Crete, they quickly adapted their trading networks and power wealth to their own Greek culture, eventually claiming the Minoans to be their own ancestors. And in a way, they were. Genetically, the modern Greeks are very similar to the ancient Minoans, meaning the two cultures blended into one. After violent conquest, of course. By the year 1450 BCE, the Mycenaean Greeks had taken control of the entire island of Crete, and surprisingly they modeled their society off the Minoans, who they just conquered. They followed in their footsteps of developing a written language and spreading the skill among their city. They even copied their economic model by concentrating all of the civilization's wealth in the palaces, and then redistributing them evenly among the nobles and citizens. This maintained a strong, centralized government, with a king and noble class at the top, controlling all of the resources of the entire nation. But they didn't just take over the Minoan homeland of Crete. They took over their entire trading empire, and within a generation the Mycenaeans became the most powerful nation in the region. Their ships traded as far as the Atlantic to the east, Africa and Egypt in the south, and the Canaanites and Hittites to the east. The Mycenaeans were making a ton of money, and they kept it all in their palace cities. For centuries, the Minoan cities never required walls, and in fact, even after the Mycenaeans conquered the island of Crete and took control of the Minoan cities, they remained unwalled. But by the years 1350 BCE, the cities all started to build walls. Now, this could either mean their wealth was growing so vast that outsiders started to look at them as potential targets, or perhaps the individual palace-states looked at each other with greedy eyes. Or perhaps the Mycenaeans were just a more violent people and they kept making enemies and needed the walls. No matter what the cause, it is evident that the environment was shifting, and this long golden age of wealth, prosperity, and peace was starting to harden. Around this time, the Mycenaean Greeks could be considered a superpower in the Bronze Age, and despite being rather late to the Bronze Age, they ended up flourishing for their short time on top. To the east, there was a new empire growing in Anatolia, and they were getting close to the Greek colonies in the Aegean Sea. This new empire was known as the Hittite Empire. Now, the Hittites were another branch of the Proto-Indo-European tree that had traveled south and crossed into Anatolia. And beyond the Hittites were Babylonians and the Assyrians. The Hittite Empire was the superpower in Anatolia and was larger than all of the other Bronze Age empires. Now, the Hittites were about to enter a political marriage with the pharaohs in Egypt, which would have united the two empires, when an assassination sent the two superpowers to war. And we know about this war because a record of the treaty still survives today. The peace treaty exists today in a museum and was discovered in two parts. The Egyptian copy of the treaty was discovered in 1828, while the Hittite translation of the treaty was discovered in 1906. Around this time, turning from the 14th century to the 13th century BCE, piracy seemed to become a real problem for the trade networks. Either because the barbarians on the outside of these wealthy trade networks were jealous and couldn't resist stealing and pillaging from the civilization, or if there were fewer resources which forced these pirates to raid and plunder.
100 feet long. So you got lots of rowers. So you might have, say, 20, 30 people on the boat.
Yeah.
Because you got to make money.
Yeah.
Whereas a pirate, he's not carrying cargo. He's got twice as many soldiers on there because they're all going to fight.
Mm-hmm.
There's no contest.
No, but when they do conquer the boat, do they just kill everyone on the boat? Or do they take
could,
the plunder and
they
put it
could
on their
kill
ship?
those who are okay to fight.
Yeah. And then just
and commandeer the slaves or the workers. You have your guards. You take that to our port. So not only do you have, why destroy the boat?
Yeah.
It's not like they had cannons.
No.
So you take the boat and the cargo.
Yeah.
Double profit.
Yeah.
Those boats cost a lot of money.
Yeah. It almost makes sense.
Oh, no, I bet they were everywhere. There was a lot of Greek pirates.
Yeah.
And the Turks would get so pissed off because it's within their empire.
Mm-hmm.
And they were land pirates. They're called brigands. But then they got bold and they come to a village where there's water, like Thessalonica or stuff like that. And they come in such force, they grab a couple of boats. Nobody could stop them.
Mm-hmm.
And they take them, they use them as pirate boats until the Ottomans got fed up with them pirating everything. So they'd send a navy after them. And they knew they were no match for the navy. They just beach it and take off back into the woods and wait it out. They could never capture them.
Were these Greeks?
These were Greeks.
Greek pirates.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They could never capture them. Because all they did was, you're too big to fight. They go to shore, abandon the boats, just leave them.
Just go.
Because they don't have to build them, they steal them.
Yeah.
This went on for years. You'll see that in that book if you've read it yet.
I have, but it was a while ago. I should take more notes.
Were you able to finish it?
Oh, I finished it, yeah. Well, that'll be season 4, I think.
Mm-hmm. One of the ways we know the Mycenaeans were trading with these distant empires is because of the record keeping done by the Hittites and the Egyptians, as well as the presence of Mycenaean Greek pottery. If you look at ruins dating to this period, you'll find evidence of Greek pottery in Egypt, Anatolia, and the Middle East. In their height, the Mycenaean Greeks had settlements all over Greece. The major cities were Knossos on Crete, Mycenae in the Peloponnese, as well as 2 other major cities, Pylos and Tyrrhene. On the other side of the isthmus was the city of Thebes, Gaea, Orchomenus. The Mycenaeans also founded the city of Athens. And surrounding these major cities were hundreds, if not thousands, of smaller settlements scattered through Greece and the Aegean islands. Now, despite what the records in Egypt state, the Greeks were not a unified empire like the other nations in the Middle East. The geography made it very difficult to unite the different city-states into one political unit, and they most likely fought against each other frequently. But the Greeks were united under a common language and culture, and could come together and work with each other if they really needed to. This lack of unity led to conflict among the Mycenaeans, and it eventually affected trade. By 1250 BC, the Mycenaeans were in serious trouble, and the frequent wars and piracy took a toll on the Greek trading networks. Trouble isn't isolated to the Greeks. The Egyptians were suffering unrest as well as the Hittite Empire. From this period onward, the global temperatures start to fall, and many regions start to suffer droughts. The lack of food and abundance of pirates made the world a dangerous place. Around this time, a Mycenaean Greek coalition of armies and city-states led a war against a Hittite vassal city in northwest Anatolia. This war went on for some time, and it drained the resources of the Greeks away from their people and homeland and directed them at a walled city on the coast of the Aegean. With all the strongest fighting men away from home, it left the Greek homeland vulnerable. This Greek versus Hittite has been referenced both by Greek historians and authors, as well as by Hittite sources, but the details are scarce. I am of course referring to the siege of Troy, and ultimately the Greeks may have won the battle, but the cost of war was great, and it would quickly be followed by the collapse of the Mycenaeans. We don't know too much about this war except for the fact that it likely happened. Archaeological and historical records support it, but we will go into more detail in the next episode. By the year 1230 BC, all Mycenaean pottery ceased to be found in ruins around the Egyptian and Hittite empires. Because all the trading was done with pottery, with grain or dried fruit or salted fish being stored in pottery, that means all exported goods from Mycenaeans ceased. The income was gone. The control of the trading routes was lost. Things weren't looking any better for the great Hittite Empire either, as a series of wars and assassinations left the empire in civil war. With the entire empire fighting, the trade network started to collapse and tax revenue vanished. The Hittites lost all control over their vassal states and subjects, leading the more aggressive and violent people of Assyria to rise up and fight their Hittite overlords. This led to the total collapse of the Hittites and the sacking of many major cities. With all cities relying on trade to feed and pay their people, riots and chaos broke out in the cities, further exacerbating the collapse. It is thought that many of these people crossed the Aegean Sea to raid Greek cities. There is a lot of evidence for this, as there are hundreds of ancient ruins from this time period completely covered in a blanket of ash. It is almost as if every major city during the Bronze Age burned to the ground at the same time. To make matters worse, the barbarian forces north of Greece, who looked upon the Mycenaeans with jealous eyes, saw their opportunity to strike. These invasions from the north only made matters worse for the Mycenaeans. Wow. In 1190 BC, the Mycenaean Greek civilization collapsed completely. What was left was chaos, violence, looting, sacking. There were too many people and no food. The population that once relied on markets to provide them with food and armies to keep them safe were now starving and defenseless. And when the barbarians came, and they did come, they massacred everything in their sight. Not a single building was spared. All of the buildings burnt to the ground. The people were either killed or enslaved.
This period is known to scholars and history fans as the collapse of the Bronze Age. It is the moment a great civilization that relied entirely on foreign trade and imported food collapsed. The moment a prosperous, enlightened, and literate international community imploded in on itself. The collapse of the Bronze Age was so devastating that it took almost half a century for people to recover. We call it a dark age, and it's called that because our light in history goes out. We only know about historical events from this far back because people took the time to write it down. We are using records and stories and inscriptions to piece together what happened thousands of years ago. This isn't like Herodotus or the ancient historians who categorized the king's deeds, although there is some of that. These are transactions, receipts, writings that tell us how many people paid taxes this year, how much grain did Egypt export, how many lambs were sold from a farmer to the market. With all of this data, we can paint a pretty good picture of life during this era. But when all of these writings stop, we enter a dark age. And that's what happened here. People stopped writing. People stopped writing because they had bigger priorities, like eating, or looking after your family, keeping the wandering bands of thugs from killing you and your son, and enslaving your wife and daughter. Dark age problems. This dark age started in Greece and Western Anatolia, but it quickly spread. And as it spread, the cities wrote about it. Egypt was at the bottom of the trade network, so they could tell something bad was happening, and it was coming their way. They even took note of it. They received regular communication from all cities in their trading networks, and one day the letters stopped from the furthest city in Greece. Then the next year, all messages from the island of Crete stopped. No reason, no warning, just nothing. No writing, no messages, no messengers, just silence. Then the same thing happened in Anatolia, and then it happened in the Levant. And then Cyprus. Darkness was spreading, and it was worrying the Egyptians. But then they came. The refugees, or the marauders and the refugees together. They came down the coast and invaded Egypt. The Pharaoh has a record of it too. He wrote about the tribes of people who were in this giant army of sea people who came riding into the fertile lands of Egypt. They were either starving, looking for plunder, or both. This army of sea people that had just burned nearly every city to the ground was now on the doorstep of the Pharaoh, and they were about to face the largest army and strongest defenses yet. The Pharaoh's archers laid waste to most of the sea people, demoralizing the ones who survived. Pictures show the Egyptian Pharaoh slaying the entire army with his own bow. The sea people might have been defeated by the Pharaoh, but they destroyed most of the outlying crops of Egypt and completely destroyed their trade network. The damage done to the Egyptians didn't kill them right away, but it was most certainly lethal. By 1150 BCE, civilization in the Bronze Age seemed to come to an end. Only a few major players survived the collapse, and their influence over the region was greatly diminished. Egypt would never be the powerhouse it once was, and the smaller states in the Middle East started to pop up along the Tigris and the Euphrates River.
What happened next is clouded to historians. We know the invasions from the north upset the Greeks living on the mainland. The Aegeans or Mycenaeans were no match for the barbaric and violent tribe of men to come rushing across the borders. Now these invaders were Greek as well. At least they were Proto-Greek. They spoke Greek, and they probably looked very similar to the Greeks. But they were a rough bunch, people from the north, and they were bloodthirsty. Most of the local Greeks caved in to their will, and were either expelled from their land and forced to find refuge on the Aegean islands, or face subjugation from their new overlords. These Greek invaders were known as Dorians. The Dorians were Greek, but they were barbaric Greek. Despite them being militarily superior, they were not as sophisticated as Aegean Greeks, who came before them. They did not know how to write, and they barely traded with their neighbors. But that didn't stop them from swooping down the mainland of Greece, crossing into the Peloponnese, and taking over the southern half of the nation and all of Crete. Many Ionian Greeks living in the Peloponnese fled with all of their belongings and took to the city of Athens, the only city still standing after the great catastrophe of the people of the sea. The refugees begged for sanctuary from the Dorians, and the Athenian government decided to resettle the Ionians across the sea and on the small islands in the Aegean and along the coast of Anatolia. As the Dorians settled into Greece, they founded cities such as Corinth and Sparta. And although the Dorians followed the traditional Greek method of forming independent city-states with local kings, it was general knowledge that a Dorian city could rely on the aid of any other Dorian city if they were attacked by outsiders.
A couple things really changed for the Greeks once the Dorians took over. As I mentioned earlier, the Dorians did not write, and that skill was lost and would remain lost for almost 400 years. Without a written language, it was common for history to be told from one generation to the next through oral traditions. And this meant that some of the greatest classic stories, legends, and mythology from the Greek Dark Age. Legends and mythology come from the Greek Dark Age. The legendary Homer was a Dorian, and his stories would have been told orally through this period. Originally, scholars thought the myths of Homer were referring to events that took place during the Dorian period, 1150 BCE to 750 BCE. However, it seems that Homer's stories were events that happened during the Bronze Age with the Mycenaeans and the Hittites. We can't prove anything Homer talked about really happened, but there are events that line up with archaeological evidence, as well as written accounts from other civilizations. With the Greeks out of the trade game, the vacuum was left for another power to rise to prominence. This group of people were not Indo-European. They were, in fact, Semitic people from the Levant. Technically, they were part of the Canaanite people who were mentioned in the Old Testament, but we know them better as Phoenicians. The Phoenicians not only took up the mantle of trade in the Mediterranean, but they mastered it. And once their alphabet made it to the Greeks, they adopted it as their own. And the first thing they wrote down was their oral history. It is here that we get the Iliad and the Odyssey, as well as stories like Jason and the Argonauts. So our next episode is not going to be a literal chapter in Greek history. We are going to cover Greek mythology, including the Siege of Troy and the Pantheon of Gods. Even though these events might not have happened in real life, they influenced the people living at the time. Every noble family in Greece found a way to sneak their ancestors into the stories, adding their lineage to the long line of Greek heroes. Well, that's it for today. Join us next time on the history of modern Greece. Stay safe and stay awesome.